we go to a difficult text in Matthew's Gospel, in the infancy narrative, there's a quotation from Isaiah 7 about a virgin becoming pregnant. And it's often pointed out that in the Hebrew it means young girl, in the Greek it means virgin. So the whole virgin birth story is just a translational mistake, silly Gospel writers. What would you say to that?
Well, I think that the fascinating thing about Isaiah 7:14 is that the Jewish translators of the Hebrew Bible into the Greek, the Septuagint translators, are the ones who chose Parthenos, specifically Parthenos, which means virgin. There was a Greek word they could easily have used for a young woman, but they specifically chose the word virgin. So the question is, why did they choose that word? And I think the reason is that they somehow thought that this birth, would be a special miraculous birth, and that it was more than, it meant more than it could mean at that moment, because of the fact that it's in the context of Isaiah 9 and Isaiah 11, which are messianic passages. So they made a connection between the birth of this child and Isaiah 9 and Isaiah 11, and thought this is alluding to yet also a future birth, a birth of a Messiah, and therefore they chose this word Parthenos. So I think it's not a Christian invention by any means, and when the virgin birth of Jesus occurs, it was immediately apparent to the early Christians that it was in fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14.
But some would then say that the Christians just invented the idea that Jesus must have had a virgin birth to fulfill a prophecy that was in the air in Judaism.
The question here is how much reliability you see in the infancy narratives, and I would say myself that there's no reason to doubt that this was a special birth. You get the infancy, you get the virgin birth in both in Luke and in Matthew. And
Luke doesn't need Isaiah 7:14, does he?
Right, he doesn't use it. So you have that evidence, and there's no reason, in my mind anyway, to dispute its authenticity.
At the other end of Matthew's Gospel is another difficult passage. When Jesus dies, apparently lots of dead people came to life and wandered around Jerusalem. Can this be taken seriously?
My own view, I think that probably this is the one place in the Gospel where Matthew has made a piece of theology into a historical story. I should say that probably Matthew didn't do it himself, as the author of the Gospel of Matthew didn't do it himself, but that this is a tradition. And I think there are historical explanations that account for this. I think what happened was there was really an earthquake or two in connection with the crucifixion of Jesus. And there was an earthquake and aftershock. With one of these earthquakes, I think some tombs actually split open as the earth shook. The tombs split open, and that tradition becomes a story that the dead were actually raised, some dead were raised at that point because of the actuality of these tombs that were split open. But in fact, it's a very difficult passage to integrate if you take it literally, because what happened to these people, where did they go, how come it's only in Matthew's narrative, if it was such a spectacular thing. So there are lots of problems associated with taking it literally. So this is, I think, one of the only places in my commentary where I shy away from historical reliability, and I say that this is probably an elaboration of a theological point, namely that in and through the resurrection of Christ, the dead will be raised.
Which opens a question, or raises a question, I think, for many. If it's not beyond the Gospel writers to do it in that case, to create or massage a narrative into existence on the basis of a theological conviction, how do we know they're not doing it at every other point in the Gospel? What are the kind of rules for working out when that can happen and when it doesn't?
Yeah, it'd be very unlikely to think that they would do it all the time, but they might have done it in one or two other instances. It could be the case in a few instances that they're trying to communicate a theological point by creating a story. But we're only guessing here. We don't know for sure, and I think it's probably good for us to be humble and say it's only a possibility that they created a story. So various people were persuaded in their own minds about this or that story.
I know some scholars have argued I mean, very few, but some, and particularly in Matthew's Gospel, that the whole thing is an elaborate Midrash, a kind of Jewish storytelling on the basis of Old Testament passages. And I know John Spong has taken that idea and run with it in his latest book, that the whole Gospel tradition is Midrash, is invented, fictional, historicising of Old Testament passages. What would you say to that? Because I know you've talked a lot about this and written about it.
Well, I don't think very much of Spong's ideas in general, quite frankly. I mean, that would be a very far-fetched conclusion to conclude that it's all just whipped up stories out of people's imaginations. Very often, the stories have a ring of truthfulness to them. If you're going to, of course, one of the things that occurs to me, if you're going to create material that way, then I would have expected the canonical Gospels to look much more like the apocryphal Gospels, in the sense of being a lot more elaborate, a lot more. If you look at, for example, at the miracle narratives, which is where you're likely to have creation, perhaps. If you look at the miracle narratives, the miracles of the synoptic tradition are very restrained and understandable. They're well linked up with the ministry of Jesus, with his purpose, with his coming. They're not sort of the sort of showy, ad hoc miracles for effect.
They're very understated in their telling. Very
understated in their telling, and they're not just put out there for show or for effect. They are, in fact, they have a kind of historical integrity about them, it seems to me.
Is there anti-Semitism in Matthew's Gospel? I mean, there's a lot of passages about Jesus castigating the Pharisees and teachers of the law.
Matthew can sound anti-Semitic at times. He can talk about their synagogues. He can report Jesus' teachings about the Pharisees, which are pretty hostile, pretty critical. But it would be a terrible mistake to think of Matthew as being anti-Semitic. After all, Matthew is himself a Jew, and it's pretty hard to think of a Jew as being anti-Semitic. He's critical of his own people.
It would be like accusing the prophets of the Old Testament as being anti-Semitic.
I mean, look at Isaiah 1. Pretty strong statements against the Jews in Isaiah 1. Exactly. So I don't think that that the Gospel of Matthew is anti-Semitic. In fact, Matthew is the only Gospel that portrays Jesus as coming in the first instance only for the Jews. As you know, in Matthew 10, he says to his disciples, go nowhere among the Jews or the Samaritans. And when the Canaanite woman comes in Matthew 15 and wants her daughter to be healed, he says, I've not come to heal the Gentiles. The Gentiles aren't even in the picture until the end. And then you get Jesus talking about the Great Commission and the gospel be preached to the whole world. But the reason for that limitation of Jesus' ministry and the apostles, the disciples' ministry to the Jews, is to show the covenant faithfulness of Jesus to the Jews. So Jesus is primarily, in the first instance, Jesus is faithful to the promises to Israel, and he comes in fulfillment of those promises to the Jews.